Hello and welcome to ELTtime with Garnet Education, where we talk with an industry guest about the hot topics and what's brewing in the ELT community.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of ELTtime with Garnet Education. For obvious reasons, English language teachers around the world are suddenly finding themselves with an urgent need to upskill and become more effective online educators. My name is Matthew George and I'm Digital Manager here at Garnet. And my guest today is Julietta Schoenmann. And together we're going to talk through the basics of online language teaching, both in terms of the nuts and bolts of how to get going and with regard to pedagogy and virtual classroom management. Julietta is a specialist in the fields of education project management, training course design and delivery, teacher development, on-the-job training, and materials design. So I'm delighted to be able to chat with her about these pressing issues. Julietta, hello. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm very good. Well, in the circumstances, pretty good anyway. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right at home.
Yeah. So to start, maybe the best thing to do is just to run through your background in online teaching and your experiences to date.
Yes, thank you. I first started off as an e-moderator back in 2010 for voluntary service overseas. I was one of their trainers on their face-to-face courses, pre-departure courses, but they moved a lot of their training online. So that was my first experience. And then since then, I've done webinars for other publishers. I was joint coordinator of IATEFL Global Issues Special Interest Group, and we did webinars as well. And that was probably my initial introduction into the online world. And then since then, it's just become ever more prevalent, I would say. So I was involved last year with the British Council in Pakistan delivering online training to groups of teachers. I've had an ongoing relationship with the Hands Up project. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah, a little bit. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So Nick Bilborough, he actually set up the Hands Up project as a charity, and his kind of vision was to get teachers from around the world to volunteer and deliver online lessons to students. And I became involved with that back in 2017. So that means giving a weekly online lesson to a class. So that's my current involvement. So that was the first time really that I started to use Zoom as a platform. And since then, I've used Zoom a lot more for training as well as for teaching.
Okay, so moving into the realm of platforms, Zoom for you is the one that you would favour or recommend to someone getting started in the online teaching world?
I think so. From my limited experience, because I'm by no means an expert, platforms like Adobe Connect, Blackboard, Collaborate, they all do much the same thing. I've used Adobe Connect for webinars, and I didn't realize that it's quite interesting, the whole system behind it, in that you, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you pay for different add-ons, if you like.
Okay.
So when we were doing webinars, we had the basics, which was the option of using a screen and sharing your screen to show your PowerPoint slides, and a chat box. But I've since discovered with Adobe Connect, it's far more complicated than that. There's so many other things that you can add. So for me, Zoom seems to do pretty much everything that I require at the moment. I think as I get more expert myself, there may be certainly other things that Zoom does which I haven't found out about yet. But no, I would say for most people, Zoom seems to work particularly well.
Yeah. And is it relatively, in your experience, simple to use relative to the other platforms? Is it just that it always works in all the different settings that you're trying to use it in? What sets it apart, would you say?
I suppose I've used it in two different ways. With teachers in Pakistan, it was simply, they were all in a room together. So there were 30 teachers. They had a projector, a screen, and they had a laptop at the front of the room. And essentially, they could hear me. I wasn't really able to hear them. The only way that I could hear them was if they came out individually to talk to the laptop at the front. So I wouldn't say that that's the best way of exploiting Zoom. It essentially allows you to share your PowerPoint slides, but it also has all these other features. For example, there is the option of breakout rooms, which means that if you have say up to, I mean, I've worked with up to 15 participants at any one time. If they're all logged in, you have their names or faces on the screen, depending on whether they use their webcams or not. And you've got the option of dividing them up into smaller groups of maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever suits your purposes. And then you can open the rooms, and they are then grouped. They can hear each other. They can share materials with each other. They obviously can chat and discuss and go through whatever task you've set them, and you're able to visit them and listen in on their conversation and join in. So yeah, that can work. That can work really well. Zoom also has things like the polling feature. So ahead of your session, you can set up a poll, which might be multiple choice type questions. It could be straightforward questions where participants can simply respond. And then you launch that poll during your live session. All the participants can see that if they're logged in, and they can respond, and then you can publish the results online as well. So it's quite handy if you want to ask questions to teachers like, what did I ask them recently? It was about their own use of online tools with their students. So we got some quite interesting results from them about how many of them have experience, how many of them are confident about using them, what they use, etc.
Yeah, confidence is an interesting one. So in you're obviously a very tech savvy person.
I don't think you could call me that. I'm open to learning. I think that's all I could say.
Yeah. But do you think for newbies and people that with very little experience of teaching online, do you think these things are relatively easy to pick up, or do you think there's a steep learning curve when it comes to picking up using the software?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think because I started with Zoom, as I described, just me and a class or a group, it was a lot easier. So all I had to do was make sure that my PowerPoint slides were, kind of visible to everybody, that they could hear me. So I started off, I suppose, at the slightly easier end of the continuum. Once you get into the realm of everybody logging in and working with you online, there is a little bit more to do. So I think the main thing is to kind of just try and keep calm, because people don't know what's happening at your end of the broadcast, if you like, simply because you've got options. I didn't mention Zoom also has things like a chat box, so you'll find yourself multitasking quite heavily, and this can be, I think it can be a little bit daunting at the beginning. So I think it's quite good to just allow yourself time to become familiar with what's available to you. Don't, for example, decide you're going to do a poll, in your first session. That's something that you can reserve for a little bit later on, once you've got all the other things in place. I mean, the basics, I think the fact that you can share your screen so that your participants can see your PowerPoint slide. You can then add in video links so that you can then show them a video, and you obviously devise some sort of questions or tasks that they do after they've watched. You can add in the features, I think, when you're ready for them. I think that, if you just deliver the basics for the first couple of times, that's fine. That's actually, and that each time then it's a little bit like driving. You kind of develop this unconscious competence after a while, so that
Sure.
You just find that things that were quite challenging at the beginning become second nature.
That's reassuring. So in terms of you're now set up, you're a relatively competent user of your platform. You'd have your Zoom or your equivalent, and you'd have, what else would you have up and running? And you'd have your slides. Would you have anything else? Any other bits and bobs running? Any other online tools or anything? Or to start with, do you recommend just keeping it simple?
I think once you've got the hang of Zoom, you can definitely start adding other things in. I didn't mention with Zoom that it has quite a neat little feature as well, which is a green screen option. So I know that a lot of teachers who are working with the Hands Up project, if they're, for example, doing a story, they've bought a piece of green cloth, which apparently they're pretty easy to get from online sources. They hang that behind them, and then you have the option of projecting any picture you like, so that you can be telling a story, and it's a, let's say it's a fairy story about, sort of some magical thing that's happening in a forest. You would have a picture of a forest behind you, and this is it's a small thing, but it's actually, I think it's quite a nice thing to do to bring stories alive, for example. Online tools, there are things that I've used, and there are things that I haven't used but I've heard are good. So for example, I've used Padlet with groups of teachers, so we may discuss something together in the live session, and then I'll leave them with the link to the Padlet which I've set up. I guess everybody is familiar with Padlet.
I am. I don't know what percentage of our listenership will be. I think it's becoming quite well known. Yeah, but to be honest, I found I've only known about it for a year or so, and it's a very good way of sharing content before and then after presentations, isn't it?
Exactly. So, you can decorate it in whatever way you like, but essentially there are things that look like little post-it notes, which at least that's the way I've used it, where students or teachers or whoever you're working with can then just post their own thoughts, suggestions, ideas, advice, or whatever on this kind of wall, and it can be shared and saved, and everybody can kind of see what people have said about particular topics. So that's worked really well. Things that I've heard about which haven't used yet, there's something called Flipgrid, which is where students make and share short videos on topics that have been sort of relevant to them as part of their learning. So you know about that one, do you, Matt?
Yeah, that's very neat. I learnt about that just the other day, and it's very neat. So as the teacher or the instructor, you pose a question. You have 90 seconds. You're filming yourself, and then it throws it open, and everyone responds with their own 90-second response, which is really good because it helps. Obviously, it means that everyone gets their time in the sun. They get their 90 seconds to respond, and then everyone. So it's a really kind of democratic way of making sure that they get their talk time, and they also get to have their say about whatever issue you've raised in your initial question. So yeah, it's very neat.
I like the sound of that. So that's one that I definitely want to try myself. The other one I've heard about, which I haven't tried yet, is Vialogue.
Okay, don't know that one.
No, don't know that one. So apparently what happens is that students watch a video, and Vialogue has a website, and there are a whole load of interesting looking videos there of various lengths. Generally they tend to be quite short. And then there's the option of conducting an online discussion about what they've seen. So I'll have to explore that one, because I think that one looks quite exciting. So as long as you can find videos which are relevant to the particular topic you've been discussing, I think it could have quite a lot of benefit for students.
Sounds great. Sounds very interesting. Okay, so let's move on to away from the kind of the nuts and bolts and the platforms towards sort of teaching styles. How would you say your teaching style differs from when you're delivering in real life?
Yeah, I think me as a teacher, my sort of teaching persona, if you like, is broadly the same. I think it's quite important when you're actually online that you look straight at the webcam, so that you're essentially making eye contact with everybody in your group. So there are sort of small things like that. I've heard of people who put a little photograph just by their webcam of a kind of group of people, and they kind of just to remind themselves that that they are actually talking to somebody, that there are real people out there who are listening to you, even if you can't see them. So I'm quite a sort of friendly, I like to think of myself as quite a friendly, approachable sort of teacher and trainer. So I hope that remains when I'm online as well. So in terms of my teaching style, I don't think there's a lot really that I've changed. And I was quite struck the other day when I was working with a group of university teachers. That's a British Council project, which is a pilot project, which has just now come to the end of its running time. We're in the evaluation stage now. It was quite interesting because I had around 14 teachers in the group. We started off, in plenary mode. I then set them up with something I wanted them to discuss, and they broke up into groups of 3 or 4 and got on with their task. I asked them to nominate a reporter in each group. I visited the rooms, each of the rooms, and made sure that they were all okay with what they were doing, that there weren't any technical problems. Their task really was to discuss something and then to produce a PowerPoint slide, a single slide with a summary of what they talked about. When they'd done that, after a couple of minutes, we all came back into plenary, and I invited the reporters from each group to report back on what they discussed using their slide. And it was quite a revelation for me, because I thought there was absolutely nothing that I did then that I wouldn't have done in a face-to-face training environment with them. And it really brought home to me the power, I think, of the online environment, which is that if you're using it in that way, you can really replicate what goes on face-to-face in classrooms and training rooms around the world. So that for me was quite an instructive moment, because, yes, if that's what you mean by teaching style, I would say that there was nothing really significantly that changed.
Yeah. I was just in terms of the kind of classroom management, setting up activities, making sure everyone knows what they're doing, that kind of side of teaching. Is that in some ways made easier almost by being online, or is that taking things too far?
I think it is. I think one has to remember also that when participants are obviously kind of involved, they are often in their home environment. So there can be the kind of distractions which you wouldn't normally have if you were all kind of together in a training room environment. I did, as you're probably aware, I was involved in a pilot scheme that the Garnet ran last year with university students in Senegal, which was a great experience. But I was very aware that I would be looking at my students, sort of on the screen, and I could see that some of them were trying to do their work from quite crowded dormitories. Some of them were outside. There was the noise of traffic. And it's the same with my teachers recently. The majority of them were women, so many of them obviously had childcare duties to perform whilst being online. So in that sense, you've got to make sure that everybody is, that they're kind of clear about what they're doing, what the tasks are, what I'm asking them to do, despite some of the demands that are being made on them, in their own environment.
Sure, interesting stuff. So teaching style. So how would you're in your Zoom room. You've gone into plenary. You've set up a task, and you would then just literally assign people into groups using the software, and just set them off into their own what they call you called it breakout
rooms.
Breakout room.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, breakout rooms, you can put them in pairs and they can work together, or you can have much larger groups as well. Something that I'm exploring, and I think that's probably my lack of knowledge, is how you can actually share the PowerPoint slide with each of the breakout rooms. What I've been doing is, if I've got a task for them, I kind of tend to cut and paste and put it in the chat box so that they can see it there. Some of them are very clever, and they take a photograph of their screen so that they go into their breakout room and they've got the task on their phones. But some of them use their phones for the actual for the link to the Zoom room. So maybe that doesn't work. So yeah, that's something I have to sort out. I'm working on that one. Yeah, it must be possible, I'm sure.
Okay, so in terms of activity types in the virtual classroom, what have you found that works well, and what maybe doesn't work so well?
Yes, I found certainly pair and group work, I think, works really well, as long as the technology is with you, because obviously I work with teachers who are often in quite challenging environments. So Senegal was a case in point where students would, because of the unreliable internet connection, would kind of come and go. So I would say yes, pair and group work can work extremely well if you're working on Zoom through the use of your breakout rooms. I found another thing that works well is handing over remote access to students. simply because they can be either in the plenary, so all together as one group, or they can be in their breakout rooms. But if you hand over remote access, anything that they have that they want to share, so if they might have something stored in a folder on their laptop, for example, or they might have a useful website link that they want to show, they can actually do that with each other, which I think is nice. Again, you want to kind of devolve responsibility slightly, because I think there's a danger possibly with the online world that it all becomes very focused on you as somebody who is kind of, setting up the room, giving the instructions. But, there are huge possibilities open to you for, encouraging student autonomy and independence. And that's one of the things that I think you can do, is the remote access. So students can present materials to each other, they can share materials, they can also annotate materials. So there is an annotation tool in Zoom where students can actually, they can have their own whiteboard and they can actually brainstorm and put things on them. You can also bring up, kind of screenshots from your course book, and using the annotation tools, you can get students to actually fill in the gaps, for example, in an activity, if it's an exercise of that nature. So that works really well. Something that I've done is a sound story where I didn't have to make the sounds. It was fairly easy to find on YouTube. A kind of minute or so of sounds, the sound of a car starting, the sound of a door slamming. And then I played them that a couple of times and then asked them in groups to come up with a story, which was based on the sounds that they heard. And that seemed to work very well, because, Zoom lends itself to something like that. There are some really nice icebreakers you can do. There's one called My Precious, which is where if you're meeting a new group and you want them to get to know each other, everybody brings along a picture of something which is important to them, and they can actually share this. If your group is small, they could do it individually. If you've got a large group, you could put them into groups and they could show this photograph of whether it's a pet or a favorite place they like to go to, or a particular type of food that they like to, anything basically which is important to them, they can show and talk about it. So that works really well. I'm just coming to the end of a project with the British Council, Teaching for Success, and I've set up on the discussion forum a task for them which is called My Farewell Gift, and I want each of them to give our group a gift. So I've already posted mine, which is one of my favorite songs. And we will then each give our gift to the group. It might be a song, it might be a video clip, it might be a picture, a beautiful picture, a recipe, it could be anything essentially. And what's nice about these is that they're very personalized tasks, which I think, enable participants, whether they're students or teachers, to contribute and feel like they're, they may be a long way away, they may be completely disconnected in terms of geographical location, but I think something like that will make people feel that they're very much part of the group and that they can get to know each other better.
Nice. Sounds nice. Lots of scope for creativity and for students to express themselves and give of themselves, which is lovely. Which I guess moves nicely into my next question, really, about motivation and keeping students engaged in this remote environment that they might be in.
Yes, I think motivation is obviously it's a key area for anybody involved in education, whether it's face-to-face classroom time or online work. I don't suppose really that I have any kind of magic answers to that, because teachers ask me this a lot, and have done over the years. I think personalized tasks, as much as possible, can make things more meaningful for students. Certainly, I think you can have a similar kind of lesson plan, if you like, to anything that you would do face to face. So you would most probably start with some kind of warmer or energizer. You can do that online as well, but obviously some energizers and warmers would obviously have to be adapted. Something that I did recently, which was nice, was I had a picture that I showed them, which was related to the theme of the training session, and they had to put a tick or a cross, depending on whether they agreed with what they could see in the picture. So, you know, that was a little warmer. It was short. It was kind of quite funny. It's funny for everybody to see the ticks and crosses appearing on the screen. And it also gave me an idea of who was involved and who wasn't. I think when we get back to this question of motivation, it is sometimes quite difficult to gauge that, simply because I suppose the way that I work with teachers, because of their own internet unreliability sometimes, you may not see their faces. You may just see a screen with their name on it. So, you know, I will see my screen and there will be like 15 little squares. Some of them will have faces in them and some of them will just be blank with the name, and it's really hard to know whether people are with you or not in that particular circumstances. I suppose the only way you find out really is when they go into their pairs or groups and you can see that they are actually engaged. But I would say that's probably something which is a little bit difficult to tell.
Sure.
I think to maintain motivation, just doing the things that you would normally do. So clear outcomes for the session that you've planned, and sharing that with your students, depending on, you know, their age and depending on how able they are. Even simple outcomes, I think it's always worth sharing, even with younger learners, so that they know what they're going to be doing in that lesson. I think variety of activities is important. So even though you're online, there's still scope for, you know, showing a video, playing some kind of listening text, for example, showing pictures. You might argue that there's actually the scope for more variety. I did an online training course last year, which was really interesting because one of the group said she'd planned this lesson around giving directions. And of course, we're all familiar with, you know, information gap activities in class where somebody will have a map and their partner will have questions or directions. But she basically did that, but with Google Street View. And
Nice.
It was brilliant because she was based in Canada, and she took us, you know, along a couple of streets, and we had to direct her, and it was absolutely brilliant, and it was far more engaging and motivating than anything I could have done with a bit of paper in a classroom, to be honest. So, you know, that was brilliant. Variety of interaction patterns as well. So not sort of sticking with the same interaction patterns, i.e. sort of largely plenary, but trying to break that up with different modes of interaction. And I think not forgetting the encouragement and praise that you would normally do in a face-to-face class. So, you know, whether you're doing that in the chat box and saying, you know, acknowledging people's contributions and saying, well done, thank you, that's great, or actually doing it verbally. But again, I think for your participants, whoever they are, to feel that you're listening, that you're interested in what they're doing, I think that will also help a little with the motivational aspect.
Great stuff. So that sounds like there's a lot of possibilities there for motivating students that might not even be available to teachers in a real life classroom. On the other side of the coin, what pitfalls would you say there are to avoid?
I think it depends really, you know, who you're working with and where they are in the world. For me personally, I think probably one of the more frustrating aspects has been connectivity, simply because, you know, with the best will in the world, people want to join your session, but either the internet goes down or the electricity, there's an outage, and therefore they can't. You can get around that by recording the live session, and then what I've done is post the link with some tasks for people who missed the session to do. So it's a chance for them to catch up on what they missed, but it's also the tasks. They might be a few simple questions or agree or disagree, you know, something to just engage them in the topic at the same time, so that they are kind of motivated, if you like, to watch the recording and to work with it. But that's obviously that's a sort of technical pitfall or practicality, if you like, and it's usually beyond anybody's control. I think I think it's really important with your groups to give them some sort of orientation to how we work online. Even though people are very familiar with the online world, it may be the first time they've ever been in a live Zoom session. So just doing the audio check, just if you can, helping them with some of the easier technical sides. They seem to, in the end, sort it out for themselves. So you may get messages on the chat box saying, I can't hear you, or can you hear me? And a few simple questions, just telling them to check their audio settings, check their volume level. You know, I'm no great technical wizard myself, so you just have to trust that they do find out what the fault is. Sometimes the equivalent of slapping the TV on the top, just telling it to log in and log out and log in can sometimes help as well.
The classic turn it off and on again. Yeah. Solves 9 out of 10 problems, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right. I think other practicalities are things like getting good at multitasking. I mentioned this earlier on. You know, the first couple of times you find yourself literally at the same time using the chat box to welcome latecomers, whilst setting up the breakout rooms, while responding to comments in the chat box, while changing the name of somebody who's managed to log themselves in as Galaxy 5. You know, you have no idea who they are. All of these things do become easier, but I think certainly at the beginning there's a lot. To me, there seemed like quite a lot to do, but it does. Yeah, I mean, it's just a question of keeping calm, I think, and knowing that all of these things are there for you to use. The chat box, the green screen, you know, the polling, all of those things I mentioned. I think it's just important that you can try and do them in as calm a way as possible, because nobody else is aware of what's going on actually, you know, on your laptop at that time. And I think it's quite easy in a way. It's a bit like the classic duck paddling furiously under the water, but looking very calm and collected on the surface. I think that's what kind of encourages me. So that even though there's a lot going on, you know, in terms of what I'm doing, the participants are unaware of that. A practical consideration is Zoom will allow you to mute all participants on entry. So when they actually enter the room, make sure that they're muted. It's quite easy to set up with the toolbar at the bottom. Or just go to participants, simply because all participants will have a degree of background noise. And if you've got 15 people with 15 different, you know, sort of backgrounds all feeding in, it's a real cacophony at times. And it can be very distracting for everybody. I think another consideration really is your boundaries and your limits. I mean, I suppose this might apply more to when you're e-moderating, which is what I'm doing also quite a lot of at the moment, in the sense that okay, let's say you've done some kind of live session and, you know, your students or your teachers will contact you. Maybe they have a question, maybe they want some follow-up resources. You know, how available are you? Are you available at any time of the day and night? Are you expected to respond even though you might be in different time zones? And if so, you know, do you make that clear to your participants at the outset? Because otherwise, certainly I've got groups that are also communicating on WhatsApp. And there is a sense, I think, and maybe that's just the world we inhabit nowadays, that you are available 24/7, and you may not want to be, or you might be perfectly happy to do that. So I think it's a good idea to decide in advance how available you want to be, and then communicate that to your group clearly so that everybody's happy with that and they know when they can contact you.
Nice tips. Thank you. I've got one more question, if I may, Julietta. So what could institutions and individual instructions do to ensure a positive outcome from this move online, this somewhat enforced move online?
I think that people have to feel that it's not a kind of substitute necessarily for face-to-face teaching and training. I think it is different. I mean, that's obvious. But I think it can do more than simply replicate face-to-face contact with students or teachers. For the reasons I've said earlier, I think there are things that you can do online that you can't actually do in the classroom. And for me, that's a very, very positive aspect of it. I think the other thing is to remember that it's not a whole world away from what people are doing anyway. I mean, your students are far more experienced and kind of open to the online world than possibly we are, simply because a lot of their time is spent online. So for them, it's very familiar. And I think for teachers too, I mean, we're all kind of, connected and wired up in some way. So I think it's just a question of getting practice and gaining confidence in actually using the platforms, because the actual nuts and bolts of it are familiar to us already. And I think people just have to get in there and try it out. And obviously they need the support of their institutions to do that. But I think seeing it as somewhere that you can have a lot of fun, it's a very kind of playful environment as well as a very valid educational environment too. And I think those two combinations in some ways, I think, make it very, very attractive. But people need to know that and to not feel afraid of it.
There we go. What words to finish on. Great stuff. I think we can finish there. So I'd like to say a massive thank you, Julietta, for your time and for sharing your expertise. This has been excellent, and I think there'll be lots of things I think there that teachers out there will find very helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I hope what I've said has actually been of use. As I've said, that there's lots more to learn, and I'm very keen to learn myself. So yeah, onwards and upwards.
Well, thanks very much, Julietta. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's it from us today. If you'd like to get in touch or to see our latest updates, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook at Garnet Education, or head to garneteducation.com/podcast for show notes and information about today's guest. Thanks for listening!